Just a few meters below the ocean's surface lies one of the most complex systems on Earth, a world where thousands of species share a relatively small space and still manage to coexist. Here, nothing happens by chance. Every movement has consequences. Every absence leaves a gap. At first glance, it looks like paradise. Vivid colors, constant motion, life in every direction. But that's only the surface of the story, because beneath that apparent calm lies an incredibly sensitive system. A balance so precise that even the smallest changes, almost invisible, can trigger large-scale transformations. And perhaps the most remarkable part is that this balance doesn't depend on a single species or a single factor. It depends on thousands of interactions happening at the same time. Now imagine, what happens when one of those pieces starts to fail? Or worse, when several begin to fail at once? Today, we dive into one of the richest and most fragile ecosystems on the planet, to understand not only how it works, but how long it can keep working. As sunlight passes through the surface of the ocean, it begins to change. Waves distort the light, creating shifting patterns that move slowly across the seabed. And then, gradually, the reef appears, not as a single structure, but as a living city. Irregular shapes stretch in every direction. Colors emerge in layers, and movement exists at every level. Small fish move in tight groups, changing direction almost instantly. Larger species cross the scene with more deliberate paths, and in between, constant activity unfolds, often unnoticed at first glance. Yet the most important element in this environment does not move: corals. Despite their appearance, they are not plants. They are animals. Each structure is built by thousands of tiny polyps, simple yet highly efficient organisms that produce calcium carbonate skeletons, generation after generation, layer upon layer. The result is a formation that can take centuries, even millennia, to fully develop. But there is a crucial detail. These animals do not work alone. Inside their tissues live microscopic algae, zooxanthellae, and this relationship supports nearly the entire system. The algae use sunlight to produce energy. Part of that energy is transferred to the coral. In return, they receive shelter and nutrients. It's a partnership so efficient that reefs can thrive in nutrient-poor waters, something rare in the ocean. But that dependence comes at a cost. If this relationship breaks down, the entire system feels it. And around this foundation, an even more complex network begins to form. Herbivorous fish control algae growth. Predators regulate populations. Smaller species maintain the health of larger ones. And microscopic organisms sustain processes almost no one sees. Everything is connected. And what's most remarkable is that this system operates without any central control. No command, no hierarchy, only interaction. And still, balance is maintained. But for how long? In recent years, scientists have begun to notice changes, some rapid, others almost invisible, but all pointing in the same direction. The reef is being tested. And perhaps never before has it been so important to understand how it truly works. Well, if you enjoy exploring worlds like this, where every detail reveals something bigger, consider subscribing to the channel. There's much more happening beneath the surface than we often realize. Now, as we move closer to these structures, the first key players begin to emerge, and with them, the invisible rules that keep this system alive. As the first light of day filters through the water, the reef slowly comes into focus. From a distance, it appears solid, almost still. But as we move closer, that illusion fades. This is not rock, it's alive. Every surface, every structure has been built by tiny organisms, coral polyps, working continuously over time. Each one secretes a thin layer of calcium carbonate, gradually forming the rigid framework of the reef. What we see today is not the work of a single generation. It is the result of thousands, built slowly, layer by layer, over centuries. It's a process so gradual that it's almost impossible to notice in real time, yet powerful enough to shape entire ecosystems. But this construction depends on one critical factor: light. Corals can only thrive in shallow waters where sunlight still penetrates. Because hidden within their tissues are microscopic algae, zooxanthellae. These algae convert sunlight into energy, and in doing so, they fuel the growth of the coral itself. It's a partnership that makes the entire reef possible. Break that connection, and the system begins to weaken. But while it holds, it supports something extraordinary. Coral reefs occupy less than 1% of the ocean floor, yet they sustain nearly a quarter of all marine species, a level of biodiversity that rivals the most complex ecosystems on land. Life moves constantly through this structure. Small fish weave between coral branches, using them as shelter. Others graze along the surface, feeding on algae. And among them, certain species take on roles that go far beyond survival. A parrotfish moves in, methodically scraping the reef. With each bite, it removes algae that would otherwise overwhelm the coral. It may look destructive, but it's essential. Without these herbivores, algae would spread unchecked, blocking light and halting coral growth. In fact, much of the fine white sand found on tropical beaches begins here, processed and broken down by fish like this. Even the shoreline carries traces of the reef's inner workings, and in the smallest crevices, out of sight, countless organisms continue their work, filtering, breaking down, recycling. Because here, even the smallest actions help sustain the entire system. And as the reef awakens fully, new interactions begin to take shape. Some subtle, others impossible to miss. At first glance, the reef feels like a place of constant competition. Every species feeding, moving, surviving. But look closer, and a different pattern begins to emerge. Cooperation. Scattered across the reef are small but crucial locations, cleaning stations. They aren't marked, but every inhabitant seems to know where they are. A cleaner shrimp positions itself on a raised surface. Its antennae wave rhythmically in the current, a signal, and it's quickly understood. A fish approaches. Its movement slows. Then, unexpectedly, it stops. In a place defined by motion, stillness stands out. The fish opens its mouth, and then its gills, exposing its most vulnerable areas, and waits. The shrimp moves in, carefully, removing parasites, dead tissue, and debris. It works with precision, moving across sensitive areas without triggering a defensive response. Moments later, it exits, unharmed. Because in this interaction, trust overrides instinct. The predator does not strike. The prey is not afraid. For a brief moment, survival depends on cooperation. This behavior is repeated across species. Cleaner fish perform similar roles, often serving multiple clients in rapid succession. But not every signal can be trusted. Some species mimic cleaners. They approach in the same way, display the same movements, but instead of helping, they bite. A quick strike. Then they disappear. It's deception, built into the system. And yet, even this has limits. Because the reef learns, and trust, once broken, is not easily restored. Nearby, another relationship unfolds, quieter but no less important. An anemone sways with the current. Its tentacles are armed with venom, a barrier few can cross, but among them, a clownfish moves freely. protected by a specialized coating on its skin. This is not a temporary interaction. It's a shared existence. The fish defends the anemone from intruders, clears debris, enhances water flow, and in return, it gains shelter. Safety. But what happens around them may be even more significant. Other species linger nearby. Observe. Take advantage of what this partnership creates. Because in the reef, no interaction is truly isolated. Each one extends outward, influencing the balance of everything around it. As the day advances, the atmosphere of the reef begins to shift. The movement remains constant. But now, there's tension beneath it. Between coral structures, a reef shark glides into view. Its motion is smooth, effortless. There's no urgency. Because it doesn't need speed, it relies on awareness. Sensitive to the slightest vibration, it detects movement long before it becomes visible. It watches, tracks patterns, waits for disruption. Around it, schools of fish move in tight formation. Their coordination is their defense, a shifting mass that makes it difficult to isolate a single target. But the system is not perfect. It only takes a moment, a slight hesitation, one fish drifting just a little too far from the group. And that's all it takes. The shark reacts instantly. A sudden burst of speed, then stillness again. The moment is over. Elsewhere, a different kind of hunter prepares. The octopus. It doesn't chase, it transforms. In seconds, its body shifts color, texture, even shape, blending seamlessly into the reef, not hiding, but becoming part of the environment itself. It waits. And when the opportunity comes, it acts with precision. Arms extend, grip tightens, and the prey vanishes. In the narrow gaps between corals, another predator remains hidden, a moray eel. Its body allows it to access spaces others cannot reach. But its most remarkable feature lies within. A second set of jaws. When prey is caught, these internal jaws extend forward, pulling it deeper inside. A mechanism rarely seen in nature, but perfectly suited to this environment. Sometimes strategies go even further. Groupers and moray eels have been observed hunting together. One forces the prey into the reef. The other blocks escape routes. A coordinated effort, efficient, unexpected. Meanwhile, prey species continue to evolve. Some rely on camouflage, others on speed. Some use patterns to confuse, or chemicals to deter. Every strategy is tested, refined, adapted. Because here, survival is never guaranteed. And in the reef, success doesn't come from strength alone. It comes from reading the moment before it happens. Not all changes in the reef are immediately visible. At first glance, everything still seems intact. Colors remain vivid. Fish continue their routines. The system appears unchanged. But beneath that surface, something has already begun. The temperature of the water rises, just slightly. 1 or 2 degrees. A difference so small it would go unnoticed by most life in the ocean. But for corals, it changes everything. Inside their tissues, the zooxanthellae, the microscopic algae that provide energy, begin to malfunction. The heat disrupts their internal processes. Photosynthesis becomes unstable. And in response, the coral does something drastic. It expels them. Without these algae, the coral loses its color. What remains is a pale, almost translucent structure. This is coral bleaching. At this stage, the coral is still alive, but it is under extreme stress. Without its primary energy source, it must rely on capturing microscopic particles from the water, a far less efficient strategy. Time becomes critical. If conditions return to normal, recovery is possible. The algae may return. Color may be restored. the system can stabilize again. But if the heat persists, the coral begins to die, and the consequences extend far beyond a single organism. When small fish lose their shelter, predators lose hunting grounds, entire species begin to disappear from the area. The reef doesn't collapse all at once. It loses complexity, layer by layer. And there is another force that can accelerate this process: the crown-of-thorns starfish. Covered in venomous spines, it feeds directly on living coral. Under normal conditions, it plays a role in maintaining balance. But when its population surges, the impact becomes severe. At night, it moves slowly across the reef, digesting coral tissue externally, leaving behind only white skeletons. Entire sections can be consumed in a matter of weeks, and often this imbalance begins far from the reef itself. Nutrient runoff from land increases larval survival. More larvae reach adulthood, and the population grows beyond control. The reef begins to shift, not suddenly, but steadily. And for the first time, the question is no longer how balance is maintained, but how much disruption it can endure before it breaks. Even under increasing pressure, the reef is not a passive system. It does not simply absorb change, it responds. And part of that response comes from species that rarely draw attention. Herbivores. From early morning, surgeonfish begin their work. They move in coordinated groups, sweeping across large areas of the reef. Their behavior is repetitive, continuous, almost methodical. Each individual takes small bites, one after another, rarely pausing. Their target is simple: algae. Individually, algae may seem insignificant, but collectively, they grow at an extraordinary rate, much faster than coral. If left unchecked, they form dense layers across the reef's surface, blocking sunlight, preventing coral growth, and slowly taking over. This creates direct competition for space and for light. And in that competition, algae have the advantage: speed. Unless something intervenes, surgeonfish provide that control. They don't eliminate algae, they regulate it, keeping it at levels that allow corals to survive and expand. And nearby, another group works with even greater intensity. Parrotfish. Their approach is more aggressive, more visible. They scrape directly against the reef's surface, removing algae embedded deep within the structure. With each bite, they grind down portions of dead coral, and in doing so, they reshape the environment. Later, this material is expelled as fine sand, a transformation that connects reef life directly to coastal landscapes. Destruction, in this case, supports renewal. Without this process, many surfaces would remain covered, unavailable for new coral larvae to settle. And without new growth, the reef cannot sustain itself. But their movement is not random. These herbivores follow patterns, returning to specific areas, leaving others temporarily untouched. This creates a dynamic mosaic: zones of active grazing, zones of recovery, areas where coral has space to grow. It's a constant cycle: expansion, control, renewal. Meanwhile, in less visible layers of the reef, other organisms support this balance. Small invertebrates break down organic matter. Filter feeders clean the water. Microorganisms recycle nutrients. Every level contributes. Every process connects. But this system depends on continuity. If these gardeners decline, the change is immediate. Algae begin to spread, first in isolated patches, then across entire sections, and once they dominate, reversal becomes difficult. The reef shifts into a different state, less diverse, less structured, less resilient. Because here, balance is not maintained by eliminating pressure, but by controlling it. While much of the reef's activity unfolds in plain sight, another set of forces operates beyond what the eye can detect. They don't move, they don't hunt, they don't interact in visible ways, and yet they influence everything. The water itself is changing. Oceans absorb vast amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. At first, this process seems harmless, but over time, it alters the chemistry of seawater. A gradual shift, almost imperceptible, but deeply significant. This is ocean acidification, and its effects begin at the smallest scale. The building blocks of the reef, calcium carbonate, become harder to produce. The ions required for its formation are less available, and that directly affects the ability of corals to grow. The change is not immediate. It doesn't stop construction overnight. Instead, it slows it, subtly, consistently. Corals continue to build, but at a reduced rate. Their structures become thinner, less dense, more fragile, like a city still expanding, but with weaker foundations. At the same time, existing structures begin to degrade, not from a single force, but from many, working together. Tiny organisms bore into the coral skeleton. Sponges carve through the calcium framework. Microbial processes weaken it from within, and then the ocean itself takes over. Waves apply constant pressure. Currents pull and reshape. What was once solid begins to erode. And this erosion now happens faster than before. Alongside this, another pressure is increasing. Extreme weather events. Storms are becoming more intense. Wave energy grows stronger. And when these forces reach the reef, the impact is immediate. Large sections can break apart in hours. Structures built over decades can be reduced to fragments. Under natural conditions, this would not be catastrophic. Reefs are adapted to disturbance. Broken pieces can reattach. Fragments can grow. The system can rebuild. But recovery depends on time, and time is becoming scarce. When disturbances happen too frequently, the reef cannot keep up. Damage accumulates. Each new event begins where the last one ended, and gradually, resilience begins to fade. Still, the story is not only one of decline. In certain areas, some corals show signs of resistance. They tolerate higher temperatures. They survive in more acidic conditions. Others recover faster after damage. Scientists are studying these populations closely because within them may lie critical answers. What allows some corals to persist while others disappear? Which traits make survival possible under changing conditions? These questions are becoming increasingly urgent because the future of the reef may depend on those answers. Meanwhile, life on the surface continues. Fish move through familiar paths. Predators maintain their routines. Daily interactions remain in motion. To an observer, the reef still appears alive, active, functional. But beneath that appearance, something fundamental is shifting. The balance is being recalculated, not in sudden changes, but through continuous pressure, invisible, cumulative, and now more than ever. The stability of the reef depends on forces that cannot be seen, only understood. For thousands of years, coral reefs have endured change. Storms have reshaped them. Temperatures have shifted. Ocean conditions have fluctuated, and still they recovered. But something is different now. The changes are no longer isolated. They overlap. And more importantly, they arrive with less time in between. At first, the impact is subtle, almost unnoticeable. A few species begin to appear less frequently. Others alter their behavior. Schools of fish become less dense, less synchronized. Nothing dramatic, just different. But these small changes are signals. The first to decline are often the largest predators. Reef sharks, large groupers, species that depend on stable, functioning food webs. The fishing pressure accelerates their disappearance, and when these predators are removed, the effect is not limited to their absence. It reshapes the system. Without them, certain populations begin to grow unchecked. Some species increase rapidly, others shift their behavior, and the balance begins to tilt. At first, it may even look like abundance. More fish, more movement. But beneath that apparent increase, there is imbalance. Some species consume more than they should. Others compete more aggressively. And slowly, the structure of the ecosystem begins to change. At the same time, herbivores, essential for controlling algae, are also affected through fishing, through habitat degradation, and as their numbers decline, one of the reef's key stabilizing forces weakens. Algae begin to spread, at first in small patches, where coral has already been damaged. But then, those patches expand. They merge. They cover entire sections of the reef. And once they reach a certain threshold, they form a barrier, preventing new coral larvae from settling. This marks a critical transition. The reef is no longer coral-dominated. It becomes algae-dominated, a different ecological state, and one that is far more difficult to reverse. The consequences ripple outward. Biodiversity declines. Specialized species disappear. The complex three-dimensional structure begins to flatten. The reef loses depth, loses shelter, loses function. But the true breaking point is not what we see. It's what the system loses, its ability to recover. In the past, disturbances were followed by regeneration. Now, recovery cannot keep pace with loss. Each new stress builds on the last. And over time, resilience fades. This is how collapse happens, not as a sudden event, but as a gradual loss of recovery. And yet, not all reefs follow this path. In regions where pressure is reduced, a different picture emerges. Predators are still present. Herbivores continue their role. Corals keep growing. These places reveal something important. The system can still function. The balance can still exist, but only under certain conditions. And increasingly, those conditions depend on decisions made beyond the reef itself. As the reef stretches closer to the coastline, the environment begins to shift in subtle but important ways. The diversity of marine life remains. The movement continues. But something new enters the scene: human presence. In many tropical regions, coral reefs are not distant ecosystems. They are part of daily life. Thus, they provide food. They protect shorelines from waves and storms. They support local economies, and in many cases, they shape entire cultures. Before sunrise, small boats begin to move across the water. Fishermen navigate the reef with precision, guided not by maps, but by experience. They know where certain species gather, which areas are productive at different times of the year, how currents, tides, and weather influence the reef. This knowledge is not recent. It has been built slowly, passed from one generation to the next, refined through observation, through trial and error, through years of direct connection with the environment. But today, that relationship is changing. The scale of demand has increased. Local fishing has, in many places, expanded into larger operations, more efficient tools, greater reach, a higher pressure on the system, and the reef does not always have time to respond. Fish populations begin to decline. Some species become less common. Others disappear entirely from certain areas. And with their absence, the balance begins to shift. But the impact is not always immediate. Sometimes the system continues to function until it reaches a threshold, and then the change becomes visible. Yet, in other regions, a different approach is emerging. Communities begin to recognize the limits of extraction, and with that recognition, new strategies develop. Marine protected areas are established, fishing zones are defined, seasonal restrictions are implemented. At first, the results are not encouraging. Reduced access, lower short-term yields, uncertainty. But over time, patterns begin to change. Fish populations recover. Larger individuals return. Reproductive cycles stabilize. And gradually, abundance increases again. This recovery does not remain confined to protected areas. It extends outward. Fish move beyond boundaries. Populations spread. This is known as the spillover effect, and it becomes one of the strongest indicators that protection works. At the same time, another economic force grows. Tourism. Divers and researchers travel across the world to experience coral reefs, and this creates a new type of relationship, one based not on extraction, but on preservation. A healthy reef becomes valuable in a different way, not as something to harvest, but as something to protect. However, this balance is delicate. Tourism itself must be managed carefully. Too much pressure, too little regulation, and even this alternative can become a threat. What becomes clear is that the reef is no longer just a natural system. It is part of a larger network, one that connects ecosystems, economies, and human decisions. And in this intersection, the future of the reef is being shaped. Across the planet, coral reefs now exist along a wide spectrum, from vibrant, thriving ecosystems to degraded structures struggling to support life. In some regions, the shift has already taken place. Reefs that were once dense with movement and color now appear quieter, simpler, less alive. At first glance, the structure may still remain, but the complexity is gone. Without healthy corals, the foundation weakens, and when that foundation is compromised, the entire system begins to unravel. The first to disappear are the specialists, species that depend on very specific conditions, certain coral formations, what particular feeding patterns, narrow ecological niches. Without those conditions, they cannot survive. And once they are gone, the system begins to simplify. Generalist species take their place, more adaptable, more tolerant, but less effective at sustaining diversity. The result is a functional ecosystem, but a diminished one. Less interconnected, less stable, more vulnerable to further disturbance. And yet, this is only one side of the story. In other areas, recovery is unfolding, sometimes in places where protection has been implemented, sometimes where natural conditions remain more stable. Here, the process moves in the opposite direction. Bare surfaces begin to change. Coral larvae settle. Small colonies take hold. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, growth resumes. Herbivores return. Algae is brought back under control. More predators reappear, and with them, balance begins to re-establish itself. But this recovery is not immediate. It is slow, measured in years, often decades. And during that time, the reef remains fragile. Every variable matters: water clarity, temperature stability, nutrient levels, species interactions. A single disruption can set the process back significantly. Scientists monitor these recovering systems closely. They track growth rates, species return, structural changes. They test restoration techniques. Coral fragments are cultivated in nurseries, then transplanted into damaged areas. But rebuilding the reef is not just about restoring coral. It is about restoring function, reconnecting relationships, re-establishing processes that sustain the system. And those processes take time. Meanwhile, human communities are also adapting. the consequences of reef decline become increasingly visible. Reduced fish stocks, economic instability, loss of food security. But where recovery occurs, benefits return, and this creates a powerful feedback loop. Protection leads to recovery. Recovery supports livelihoods, and livelihoods reinforce protection. This is where the future begins to shift. Coral reefs have never been static systems. Even under natural conditions, they have always evolved. Growing slowly over time, breaking under physical stress, rebuilding in new forms, continuously adapting. But now, this process is unfolding under unprecedented conditions. Change is happening faster. Disturbances are more frequent. And the drivers of those changes are no longer purely natural. Still, the reef continues to respond. In some regions, a more resilient coral species begin to dominate. These are not necessarily stronger in the traditional sense, but they are more tolerant, able to withstand higher temperatures, more resistant to chemical changes in the water. And as they expand, they begin to reshape the structure of the reef. The result is not the same ecosystem as before, but it is still functioning, still alive. Fish populations adjust accordingly. Some species alter their feeding strategies. Others shift their territory. Some disappear from certain areas, while others emerge. The system reorganizes continuously, trying to maintain equilibrium under changing conditions. But this balance is no longer determined by ecological processes alone. Human influence is now embedded within it. Decisions about fishing, pollution, coastal development, climate impact, all of these factors feed back into the reef. In many regions, efforts are being made to reduce these pressures. Protected areas expand. Sustainable practices are introduced. Monitoring becomes more precise, and slowly the effects begin to appear. Not instantly, but progressively. The reef stabilizes, recovers portions of its complexity, rebuilds interactions, and this leads to a crucial realization. The future of coral reefs is not predetermined. It is still being shaped by natural processes and by human choices. The balance is not lost, but it is no longer guaranteed. It is something that must be maintained. From above, the ocean can seem endless, almost silent, a vast surface moving slowly with the wind. But beneath it, the reef is in constant motion. Every second, countless interactions unfold. Corals are building, yet fish are feeding, cleaning, competing. Predators are watching, waiting, striking. And beneath all of it, invisible processes continue to sustain the system. Nothing here exists alone. Every species is connected to another. Every action creates a reaction. Every absence leaves a space that must be filled. This is not just an ecosystem. It is a network, one built not on control, but on balance. For millions of years, coral reefs have maintained that balance. They have adapted to change, recovered from disturbance, rebuilt after destruction, again and again. But what they face now is different. The changes are happening faster, more frequently, and across larger scales than ever before. And for the first time, those changes are not driven solely by natural forces. A single species now plays a defining role: humans. Through the way we fish, the way we develop coastlines, the way we alter the chemistry of the ocean itself. We are now part of the system, whether we intend to be or not. And that changes the nature of the balance. But this is not only a story of decline, it is also a story of resilience. Because in many parts of the world, reefs are still responding, still adapting, still finding ways to persist. Where pressure is reduced, life begins to return. Corals grow, fish populations rebuild, interactions re-establish, and slowly the system starts to recover. Not perfectly, not exactly as it was before, but enough to function, enough to survive. This reveals something essential. The reef does not need to be recreated. It needs the opportunity to recover. Time, stability, and the conditions that allow its natural processes to continue. Look, the question is no longer whether coral reefs can survive. They have proven that they can. The real question is, what kind of future will we allow them to have? Because the answer does not lie only beneath the water. It lies in the decisions made above it, in how we choose to interact with the ocean, in how we value what we cannot always see. If this journey has changed the way you see the ocean, consider subscribing to the channel. Because understanding systems like this is the first step toward protecting them. And as sunlight filters through the water one last time, illuminating structures built over centuries, the reef remains alive, dynamic, still holding on to its balance, as it always has. But now, its future is no longer shaped by nature alone. It is shaped by us.